All right, folks. Hey, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Ben, do we have Ben on the agenda for Ambient API auditions?
Yeah. And yeah, if someone can go ahead and share the notes. So the this ties on to the thing we talked about before. The other addition is the 3361 there, which is ambient only pod level opt-out for DNS. The reason we want to do this, basically this would be a label that would disable ambient DNS capture for a specific pod. The reason we want to do this is because we want to turn on DNS capture by default in ambient. Currently it's default off. We would like to turn it on. As I mentioned in a comment there, we don't have any specific reason why we think that wouldn't work, but it does change DNS resolution behavior for the pod. And so having a pod level opt-out in place first is the motivation here, so that if there is a problem, like some very fragile app that depends on DNS resolution behaviors or whatever breaks, then they can apply the label, or sorry, the annotation on the pod and opt out of it. So it's sort of just basically a safe hold for turning this on by default. Go ahead, Costa.
So a few thoughts on this. First of all, there is already a first-class, well-defined mechanism for user to modify the DNS in pod. I don't know if it can be used or it cannot be used. DNS problems are probably one of the most complicated to debug, to understand, and very, very few people are fully, aware of all the DNS problems. All the memes with it's a DNS have some truth to them. So I would be very, very scared of having DNS enabled by default if we believe that there is any chance that it will break something. So we did this kind of stuff in the past, and we had so many problems with Istio, but Istio is classical with sidecar, but sidecars are opt-in. Ambient, it's like CNI, it's something that should be on by default. So if we are 100% that the L4 works 100% perfect, then we can enable ambient by default in the entire cluster. If 100% the DNS works as well as Kubernetes DNS, we should enable it. But you cannot say that, hey, some pods may be broken and customers, who knows, maybe they will figure out that it's DNS and troubleshoot it and figure out it's this annotation. And at the same time say that we are ready to enable it by default, or we should enable it by default. So either we take over DNS, or we because we are 100% sure that it's as good as our CNI implementation, our L4 implementation, or we wait until we are sure, because it's a very, very risky thing.
I don't think we are going to be sure, though, unless we turn it on by default.
Come on,
there's no way to know 100% for sure, right? The difficulty with this is the reason we want to turn it on is stuff like service entries and their egress flows also that just won't work if we don't do the DNS proxying. So there are features that won't work if we don't turn it on. But also, like, we don't have any. We have to get people to try it, and if it's off by default, and being off by default means features are off by default, that's a weird place to be in. So that's kind of the thing we're trying to solve here.
I mean, in 0.1, it was okay to turn a feature, to say, hey, let's turn a feature on because we want to kind of force everyone to test it. But used using production. I mean, how can we? I don't know. That appears. But it's crazy.
Okay.
I mean, at this point in the project, to claim that, oh, we have this feature, we don't know if it works. Let's turn it on by default.
I mean, we aren't going to know if it works. We don't have any reason to believe it wouldn't work. But as we all know, there's always a pathological workload out there. So I'm also fine just turning on DNS by default now and not doing the sanitation. This was sort of a extra safeguard in case something does happen. But I'm also fine just turning it on and see what happens. And people could turn it off if it doesn't work. I don't think there's any real scenario where it wouldn't work. But again, I'm not omniscient, so there's probably one out there that none of us have thought of. But yeah, I'm happy to defer that discussion if we want to. If do we think that we need an opt-out before turning it on globally, I guess is the fundamental question.
I think the opt-out is useful regardless of if we turn it on by default, because a substantial portion of users may be turning it on explicitly and then wanting to opt out. It doesn't really have there's no need to couple it to default.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of that, the other thing with the virtual interface is like for the tail scale scenario I was testing, there's actually a scenario where you might want to enable DNS for everything, but turn it off for the tail scale pod specifically because it does its own DNS stuff. So that would be another place where you could use it outside of the default.
So basically, everyone who's doing his own DNS stuff will need to read the documentation, other annotation, and understand that their pod is doing some DNS stuff, which many people don't know. And that's why messing with DNS is complicated. And then it's a mess.
I completely agree. Like, there's always going to be potentially some workload that is doing something weird with resolve.conf in the pod. I don't know. Like, who knows? Like, and you don't know what so. That's why the opt-out. We can't really anticipate that, but also we can't support certain features without proxying DNS. So that is sort of a catch-22.
That's not necessarily true, and I would be much happier if we had this after we have all the features working with proper DNS, because we have to admit that intercepting DNS is a hack. It's clearly going to break if people have libraries that use IPsec and all the other things DNSSEC and all the other things that validate DNS and prevent interception. And so it's known broken before you launch it. So if we had the option to use real DNS, meaning you use DNS, external DNS or any controller to program DNS and have feature parity, then it's good. But having another Istio weirdness that only works with Istio in a particular case and doesn't work if you don't have DNS interception enabled everywhere, that's a very, very dangerous thing. And we already made those mistakes a couple of times.
Austin, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think Ben's proposal is just given that we already have a DNS proxy feature, should there be an opt-out? Sounds to me like what you're talking about is, should we have DNS proxying at all, or could we do external DNS instead, which is really not the question at hand.
My point is we should not have features that only work if DNS is enabled by default. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to have, just like we have disable ambient completely on a pod, which also kind of disable DNS interception. So technically you already have this. We turn off ambient and you don't have DNS capture. But, and I don't mind another one. My concern is how it is implemented as annotation versus resource. But my concern really is with having features that only work if you have DNS interception enabled, just like we had with sidecars. And not being able to have that feature work in any other situation except if you and then claiming those are GA and ready and working. So that's my concern. Maybe I spend too much on DNS, debugging DNS and dealing with problems, but
yeah. So basically, what Ben is asking, to Mitch's point, he's only asking, does it make sense to add a pod annotation to allow user to config bypass DNS capture, right? Whether it's true or false, that's the only thing he's asking.
Yeah, I think what Costin is saying is, like, right now it's either you're all in ambient or you're not. That's the pod state that we have, and this would introduce the pod state of you're in ambient but out of ambient DNS, which is a further wrinkle.
Exactly, and then debug these problems and figure out what it is, and good luck, with DNS troubleshooting. Because who knows what will break? I mean, if you're saying that some features depend on this, who knows which features will break? Do we have clear understanding what is the impact of a small change in DNS, and what happens if the application is bypassing interception by doing DNS over TLS, for example? Who knows?
I'm a bit confused why we don't want to give users the ability to opt out. Like in every other feature, what I've heard from people, including you, is that we want more pod level opt-outs and less global opt-outs.
I'm not against having an opt-out for DNS per se. I mean, it's not. It's a bit deeper than this particular PR, which is adding an annotation. I mean, I have a problem with this PR because it's annotation and not another resource, but that's probably not a big deal. My concern is with the bigger statement that he is making, that we want to enable DNS by default because some features only work if DNS is enabled by default. And then we are not entirely sure if it works, but we are still going to enable it by default. And we give people an option to opt out, which is not clear what it will do, because some features will obviously break because they depend on DNS being on. So it's a much bigger, you need to look at a kind of, just annotation. We have 100 annotation, 101 is not a big deal. But the implication of where it's going with DNS and the fact that we are, again, messing with DNS.
So I just don't really understand. Like, we know what DNS does. We know the impact it has. We know that we haven't seen bugs in it. We know that a majority of users are turning it on by default explicitly. We have a lot of feedback from that from users. What exactly is the bar to make it on by default? Or are we just going to continue to recommend at all points, install Ambient, use set profile equals true, and set DNS capture equals true?
Yes. I mean, if you want to use Ambient DNS, you set Ambient DNS. Just like, I mean, it's two different services. DNS is one service, is one standard. L4 networking is another standard. There is no reason. I mean, the fact that we are saying that some Istio features are coupled and only work if you both mess with DNS and send L4, that something is wrong. I mean, with all CNI layers, you can still use core DNS. You can use a different DNS. It's not a tight coupling between L4 security and DNS. You can pick a different DNS server and you expect everything to work as before.
That's really not true. Like, all these other CNIs have FQDN policies that rely on them doing exactly this. And that's exactly the same feature in Istio, effectively, that needs this functionality, is to do egress gateways, which is more or less FQDN.
What do you mean? DNS in Istio, DNS in Kubernetes, you can set core DNS, you can use a different DNS. It's completely orthogonal to L4. L4 does not...
no, I'm talking about the CNIs, like Cilium, Calico.
Cilium doesn't mess with DNS, as far as I know.
Yes, it does.
Calico doesn't.
Yes. They all have a policy called FQDN policies that can say, I only allow traffic to google.com, for example, and they implement that by intercepting DNS.
That feature is, we can discuss the security and the reality of that feature separately.
So,
I mean,
I guess...
Austin, just
Yeah,
speak.
no, go ahead.
Well, Keith, you have your hand up straight.
Yeah, I think for me, I still am not sure I completely get Costin's point here. I mean, sure, users can change their DNS server, but why would we as a project want to add more friction to our features? So to me, it's less about users being able to modify the details of their DNS config and more about reducing friction. If we feel like the feature is tested, if it meets our standards for quality, yeah, let's turn it on by default and reduce friction in an already very complicated project like Istio. Thinking about service entry or multi-cluster, you need DNS interception for those things to work at their maximum capability while we add friction there.
That's first of all not true. I mean, obviously, there are MCS implementations and many other implementations that work perfectly fine without messing with DNS, capturing DNS.
Which implementation worked without changing DNS.
What do you mean? GKE doesn't change any DNS. It's using the public, the enterprise DNS, and it's perfectly fine.
So if your
But that's
solution
only
to
for
Istio,
enterprise.
yeah, if your
Sorry.
solution for Istio is you have to use Google's DNS server, that's not really valid, right?
Or Microsoft DNS server, or,
Sure,
or
any
Amazon
DNS
DNS
server,
server,
right?
Cloudflare DNS server.
The ability to integrate into cloud solutions is, I think, a thing that is important in Istio. The requirement to do so, I don't think, is acceptable.
I'm not saying it's a requirement. I mean, we have DNS interception, obviously. I'm saying that users should be able to, we should not have features that only work with Istio hacks, basically, which is DNS
They don't.
interception.
You can turn on DNS interception, which works universally, or you can turn it off and use your enterprise DNS, which 0 people do, but if someone wants to do it, there's nothing stopping them from doing it.
And we have features that no longer work because they are only implemented with Istio hack.
There's no feature in Istio that cannot be implemented with an external DNS server.
But it's not available. So pretty much we are saying that we force people to use anyway. It will blow back, guaranteed. That's just think about the security issues introduced by DNS capture, which is basically service entry allowing hijacking DNS and pretty much messing up everything. It's just a matter of time until a blowback when as adoption of DNS security increases.
I mean, Costin, I just don't totally buy it. Like, one, if everybody user is enabling it, right? Like, we're just giving API friction. Literally every user is enabling it. Two, like, service entry's ability to override a DNS, or particularly a delegated DNS entry using like the public DNS delegated of your enterprise DNS is a feature, not a bug. Right? Any system that's just doing FQDN style capture, right, has to do that, whether it's us or Palo Alto Firewall or CNI. Right? They all do it. Right?
And
like they all do it.
And
well, no, I mean, they all have to document the security implications of their decision, right? And admins have to be cognizant of them. That's fine. Right? We are no different in that regard. Like, we will absolutely have to document the security implications of that, and admins should understand what it means to override google.com. And there should be reasonable controls on the scope of how people do that, right? Whether it's us or some admission control solution. All those things are true. And yet users still will want this feature and are like, regardless of the networking product, whether it's a mesh, a CNI, a firewall product, so on and so forth, they're all doing it. Like, there's nothing novel here.
Well, first of all, we are not documenting it. Second, we are doing it slightly different because we allow any namespace to override any name, and we have very little control and very little documentation about this. I mean, we know that it's what the problem is, but we don't necessarily tell user how crappy it is. And that's okay, in
so
theory,
all right,
it's
so
a feature.
It's a feature. We could document it. We could do better. Like, I wholeheartedly agree. We could do a better job documenting it. Whether we have to provide all the controls or the controls should be extrinsic. Like, everybody who can access a Palo Alto firewall system today can tell it to override DNS. How do they manage who inside an organization controls that? Right, is sometimes left as an exercise to the implementer, right?
It's a pretty important thing. I mean, saying that any pod can decide, if it allows or if it bypass or not. I mean, it's a security concern. I mean, even in this annotation, I'm saying that if you have a policy that requires that google.com is intercepted and you allow pods to override it, again, security model is very, very weak in pretty much everything we are doing with DNS. And DNS is critical for our security and so forth.
Ben?
Yeah, I was going to say, Costin, what would you be happier with? I guess would you be happier if we had the? It sounds like you wouldn't be happy with the pod level opt out for the DNS capture specifically. You would be happier, quote unquote, air quotes, with just it's either in the mesh or not, and we don't have a specific opt out for DNS, right? So, like, would you be happier if we just always turned it on and, like, if there's a problem, you just take your pod out of the mesh and that's it? Is that
no? With a mesh config or a CRD or a CR or whatever, I mean, not sidecar but something similar, where you as admin can be in control and can decide the policy instead of the pod opting out. At least that takes away some of the risks from the pod owner, and you allow some security control. I mean, like we should have done with sidecar, with service entry, allowing to override the arbitrary things in any namespace. We should kind of make it more enforceable and more controllable and
that kind of bleeds into the second thing, the auto enroll too, because that's a similar discussion there of should it be something that it can be centrally controlled, or should it be something that pods can opt out of?
Exactly.
I agree on that. But setting that aside, I agree that that's the thing we need to discuss, at least. Setting that aside, assuming it could be centrally controlled, do we want pod level DNS opt-outs at all?
No,
or do we just
I'm not
okay.
I'm not against pod. I mean, as an admin or someone who has RBAC permission to control DNS policy, I should be able to enable or disable or whatever I want. My question is, if this is something that is tightly controlled, that an admin can say, hey, only this user can override DNS, can set service entry to redirect google.com to some random stuff, not put it in a notation and say, hey, you can use OPA. Who knows? Maybe if you figure it out, good luck.
Yeah, that's the bigger question. Okay.
And if you find a problem, do you need to redeploy the pod, or you can just, presuming that you implement dynamic updates or whatever, you can just fix the problem without killing the entire production, do another deployment, go figure out in help how do you put annotations.
Yeah.
It's the security level basically, or who can mess up and break stuff. If a DNS admin expert can do that, well,
I think, and that is a bigger problem, I think, with Ambient generally. Like today, for instance, like opt-outs of Ambient prefer the pod level opt-out, right, over the namespace. So if you wanted to say, I want to enforce that every pod in my namespace is Ambient captured, you can't do that because it's a pod level opt-out. Which, that's current state. That's probably a larger discussion of how we want to change that. I do have concerns about a top level control, because usually in the real world, you have a cluster operator and somebody who owns the ISO install and completely different teams maybe deploying apps. And it's difficult for them to figure out how to get their thing working if every time anything doesn't work, they have to go ask some other team to change a centralized config.
That's not, I never said centralized config. I said that's CRD, where the user can, you can grant namespace owner, for example, if you choose to, or you can grant some group that is DNS admins, or you grant someone who knows what security is and is not just
namespace scoped, but not cluster scoped, is what you're saying.
That's perfectly fine. Of course, namespace. Cluster scope is for very special things. Yeah, no, namespace scope with RBAC permissions that user can choose. Hey, I trust everyone who deploys the pod to decides with an annotation what to do or not.
Yeah. Okay.
So can we separate the two discussion? Because I think, Carsten, what you are asking is something could potentially build on top of what Ben has been doing, right? So what Ben is doing is building the essential building blocks to allow people to opt in and opt out DNS capture. What you want on your wish list, I would say, is about some policy control over that. We don't right now have a model to do that in Ambient. I think that requires follow-up discussion for whoever willing to drive that forward. But at this stage, I'm not hearing like strong objections on adding this particular annotation to the pod to allow user to have the flexibility to opt out or opt in for DNS capture. Is that fair?
That's what I've trying to say so far. I have strong objection to adding it as an annotation. I have no problem with adding it as an opt-in, opt-out if it's separately controlled. And just like service entry, theoretically, you can set an RBAC permission on service entry and prevent them from arbitrarily modifying DNS. It should be at least at the same level. I mean, it's not safe to do it as an annotation. That's my strong objection. That's, I don't know, you can do whatever you want, but security matters in DNS. It's critical for security.
I don't disagree with any of that. It is a little troublesome as a random user to not have it. It's very convenient to have a pod level opt out if you're trying to get people to try something with an existing workload. But I agree, it's not really tenable if we want to get into the security enforcement business in terms of enforcing that you're in a mesh or not, you have DNS capture or not, or whatever else.
But from a user perspective, Ambient is opt-in and out at pod level and namespace level. So from a user perspective, Ambient is also the security function, right? The moment I opt in for Ambient, I got mutual TLS configuration automatically enabled for me.
Right.
So from that perspective, this is just a continuation of the configuration we have in Ambient.
It is.
Whether it's enable Ambient or DNS capture. So I think from a user perspective, this is the right place. If I'm a user, I'm looking at the configuration, right? This would come natural. I really think, Carsten, what you are proposing is something bigger. We don't have precedence of doing so in Ambient. That really requires a much larger discussion and thinking.
So let's defer that and bump down to the next one then, because the same question arises here for auto enroll, really, which I think John had mentioned. And this is currently also, so if you scroll down to the auto enroll. So what this is, the PR there is basically saying, look, we want Ambient to be default on in more cases. And what this PR does basically is say, look, any pod that isn't already explicitly labeled for inclusion or exclusion, we enroll it in the mesh unless it's in a deny list of namespaces. So basically, if you set this flag you can just look at the PR summary there. If you set this, it has the PR summary has the particular flags, just the comment.
This one,
Yeah.
the release
No,
notes?
no. The auto enroll. Next other tab, the ambient auto enroll. The previous tab, not this tab, the other tab.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. I'm talking at
yeah,
the
just
wrong one.
just
Okay,
the
gotcha.
yeah. So what this
All right.
does is adds those two flags there, right? So auto enroll, true, false, and exclude namespaces. What this would do is basically say, for all pods in all namespaces except in that exclude list, if they aren't already otherwise labeled explicitly, we put them in ambient. This is basically designed to let you quickly enroll a whole cluster without having to go and manually label every namespace. And the current implementation of this, the labels that we already have still have precedence. So if you auto enroll something, if you auto enroll everything but exclude a pod with an explicit label, then it will be excluded. If you don't auto enroll a namespace, but you explicitly include it with the labels, we will include it, right? So the labels always win, but auto enroll is what to do with everything else that's not explicitly labeled. What I think, if you scroll down, John brought up was that, you know, he wanted to have this maybe as a centralized or more centralized config so that it's, again, not label based. Because again, if this can't really be an enforcement mechanism with Ambient as it sits. Because if you turn on auto enroll, that you can't enforce all pods are auto enrolled because pod level opt out is always respected, right? So you could say, I want to auto enroll everything, but these pods, you know, somebody put an exclude on them because we respect the pod opt out always. They'll be out no matter what your auto enroll setting is. So that's why the actual question here I have is, do we want to separate enforcement of policy from these things, right? If we want to say that Ambient has some sort of like Ambient enrollment is a policy with quotes, right? Where we say these are the things that can be enrolled, these things might need DNS opt-outs, whatever. That sounds like an API, right? If it's a policy and not a config anymore, it probably needs to be an API. And that bleeds more into what Costin is talking about for the DNS as well, right? Of we need basically a enrollment CRD, which is a terrible name, but something like that, where it's like here we define in this CRD, in this API, what is and is not enrolled. And if it is enrolled, what specific opt-outs with pod matchers and label matchers and that kind of thing. So like I guess the bigger question is, since we have these things, is that what we're talking about here? Something like a ambient enrollment CRD, as opposed to a bunch of flags that are all, you know, controlling what labels do with pod level opt-out.
For the record, what I said earlier was about DNS. For
Yeah, no,
the
but
ambient enablement, it's a
yeah.
completely different answer. It's my opinion. In CNI, in Cilium, in any vendor, you cannot opt out of their networking to say I want to use a different networking. So my opinion,
but
if we believe ambient works,
you can,
but you can also turn it off. An administrator probably can turn it off and disable this, or make some patch to Istio and make sure that nobody can mess with this. So I don't think L4 networking should have an option, because again, you introduce all kind of bugs, support, and problems, and there is no real reason. I mean,
so when you say it shouldn't have an option, you're saying that L4 networking should not have a pod level opt out, or it should?
I never seen in any network, any vendor that allows you to opt out of their networking. I mean, Google, if you run on cloud, you use Google networking, whatever encryption we have, Andromeda, whatever.
Okay.
If you are Cilium, I haven't seen an option to not use Cilium for a specific port. Maybe there is one, but I haven't used it. So I don't see a point. It was good for when it was experimental or good, but if it's GA and we are confident on it, why opt out?
Yeah, I mean, the only difficulty of that is that that's a behavior change, right, from what we've already shipped. And that would itself have to be opt-in, and it would need opt-out mechanisms. And if we say that the only opt-out mechanism is at the namespace level in that mode,
I'm saying is there is no opt-out. I'm saying, we should add an option in Istio. When you install Istio, you get ambient 100% no opt-out, no choice, no
Right.
escape.
But I mean, but there's always going to be cases where you need opt-outs, right? There are namespaces that you don't want to ambient capture, for instance. Like
Right.
say,
Is there any case
you know,
you don't want capture, you don't want to use Google networking or Microsoft
What if you
networking?
have a pod running UDP in Kubernetes?
Costin, what you're
Z-
saying
ZD
is a very reasonable requirement for some users, but it's extremely opinionated, right? That's exactly what the PR is enabling. Like, you can't actually do what you want today, and with this PR, you can. But I think it's a big stretch to say that we're so opinionated that the only thing you can do is globally turn on ambient for every single pod in your cluster. You have absolutely no control over it, and we're just going to go do that in a new minor release. After for 8 years of Istio, we've always had it be the ability to control it on a more granular level.
But that's not what I said, John. I said that as an admin, I should be able to install Istio in a mode that doesn't allow pod to do whatever they want.
Yes, that's exactly what we want to add. I don't see what. Yes, we should. I completely agree. We have that mode, and that's what I want. That's what this PR is enabling. Right?
That mode is a global option to say, hey, as an admin, you have no option to opt out.
Right.
And
That's why we want to add a
option.
match expression at the global level that lets you define what pods are enrolled. And if you don't want to add an opt out, you just say everything is enrolled and there's no. Now this
Okay, I can live with that.
Yeah,
if it's
like this.
admin driven.
Yeah, maybe we're
Hold on.
confused because I think there's been some different proposals on the exact API. So sorry if I jumped the gun a bit. I think there should be a matched expression at the global level, and they can say it's included if it has ambient mesh equals enabled. They can say it's included if it doesn't have ambient mesh disabled, or they could say it's just always on, right? Like it's the same
that
way.
That way you can have labels. People can still add labels to their pods to do what they want, but it's at least centrally controlled.
Right, it's a flexible model.
Yeah.
Like that's how webhooks work, for example.
Yeah,
you don't expose all the options to use to sidecar users because, well,
yeah, that obviates some of my concerns about the central administrator thing, because the central administrators could always allocate certain labels that you could use if they want to allow that at the pod level, and then they can free up app teams to put those labels in their pods. I guess the other question there is mesh config. You had originally said put that in mesh config. The problem with that is that currently Istio CNI does not read mesh config. We could add this to mesh config as another option and make Istio CNI consume mesh config. But that seems a little weird and roundabout, considering the only thing that would ever consume these properties would be Istio CNI, which doesn't currently read mesh config. So should we? Yeah, I
think I agree with your.
CRD.
I think I agree with what you said about making it not in mesh config. We actually had this exact feature, and it wasn't mesh config before, and it was a pain.
Okay.
And it also makes things even more of a pain if you consider like the whole running CNI in a different namespace.
Yeah. Okay. So something that looks like that but isn't in mesh config is what we're angling at. Looks like. Okay.
So question, if it's not in mesh config and if it's a Helm value, does it mean if I need to change the Helm value, I would have to rerun the installer again? I assume that's the only way. Is that right?
If it's a CRD, maybe not, right? That's the thing.
Yeah, that's the advantage. I agree. But I almost feel is CRD a little bit more too complex for the simple purpose, because this sounds like something very simple to config. Keith, go ahead.
For what it's worth, it's not completely done yet, but I'm got a proposal for something that looks exactly like this for multi-cluster. So if there is a CRD, it wouldn't just be for Istio CNI. The shape would look fairly similar.
And we also already have one that's in mesh config for discovery selectors.
Right, that's what I was. That's actually exactly what I was thinking initially. User already familiar with how to configure Discovery Selector. This looks exactly the same thing as Discovery Selector, where you can opt in for the entire cluster, or you can opt in selectively based on label selector, so you don't have to list all your namespaces, or you can opt out.
So are we? So that CRD, which is not mesh config, would be something that we could consume in Istio CNI or have sections in it. Okay, I need to look at that, I guess.
I would much rather just have it be in the normal CNI config. It's going to be far simpler.
We could start there at least. That's
Users.
not difficult. Yeah.
Easier for admins. I think it's easier for everyone. Easier for us for sure. Like that's gonna be 10 times less work.
I'm hesitant to put that config in a global config until we know we need to. So I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, and this is probably not something your admin needs to change a lot, because what they can do is, assuming Ben, you're thinking about adding label selector, right? So they can just have the selector exclude or include labels, and then they don't have to change it. They can just tell their user, hey, use this label if you want to opt in or out. So they'd be done with it.
Okay, yeah, I'll stick to having it be that type of selection in the CNI config for now, and we can table discussions of a little larger CRD or whatever and do that when we need to. That sounds reasonable to me, if everybody's okay with that.
Okay, I'm seeing a lot of +1. So that's great. Yeah, if people can record their +1, that would be good too. As Ben is writing the decisions. I think, Ben, you are the only topic for today. Should we circle back to your other topic now that this one is easy to reach consensus?
There are a bunch of like future topics.
Yeah, let's go back up to the Keith has a bunch there. Let's do them.
Okay, sorry about that. I completely missed it because it wasn't moved in here.
Yeah, no problem. I've kind of added a bunch, and there's another topic not by me in the future section as well. But this one's kind of short. Just similar to what we discussed in the TOC call on Monday. Looking for last round of approvals from TOC on Ambient protocol doc. Had a couple of small edits today from folks. Appreciate some of the corrections, but I think it's pretty much good to go. So if there's any outstanding questions, maybe we could discuss here in the time we have left. If it's a matter of just folks needing time to read, then I can follow up with folks offline.
Yeah, sorry, Keith, I've been a little swamped, so I haven't quite met my requirements yet, but I will try to in the next couple of days.
Yeah, sure. I'll like I said, follow up async then on that one. Honestly, the rest of my topics are just sort of questions and follow up from KubeCon and Ambient things that I've seen in the community. So if Andrew is still around, I'd love for them to come in and talk about their topic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And basically, I'm working with Ambient, and I'm trying to figure out how to do a default deny posture within Ambient, similar to what I would have done with a sidecar. And I don't know if I'm just missing the pattern or if maybe there's a gap still. But like in sidecar, you can make say in a CR system, a global allow nothing policy, and then everyone's going to have to make some other policy that says like A is allowed to talk to B, and that works great. But in Ambient with waypoints in the mix, if I have say a namespace served by a waypoint, and then I do enable the waypoint to talk to the pods in that namespace, I've then probably accidentally allowed all workloads on the mesh to talk to those destinations, because there's no good way at like the global level to have said, don't let anything through this waypoint unless I make an authorization policy for it. Or at least that's the case that I'm perceiving. Maybe I'm missing something, but it kind of feels like I'm missing some sort of waypoint equivalent of the global allow nothing policy that you get, for a sidecar. Oh, and I should add, this is, not solvable, but for any given waypoint, I can bind a allow nothing policy to that waypoint, and then I do prevent traffic going through that waypoint to all of the other things it can serve. But it's not like a fail-safe situation. I need to know if I made a waypoint, I also need to make an allow nothing policy for that specific waypoint. There's no like admin kind of high level policy that could have been created to prevent me from accidentally doing that.
By the way, you could apply a default deny pattern at the mesh level. That would apply to your waypoints too. So you don't have to apply individual default deny pattern for your particular waypoint.
It is so at the mesh level. How do you mean? Like I guess I'm not sure how
You just
form
deploy
that.
it same as the sidecar. I think you can deploy it in the Istio system namespace or whatever your root namespace is, and that should impact your waypoint.
I don't know. If,
So
I, go ahead.
the problem is that when you deploy a denial policy or an allow nothing, I should say, cluster wide, then it doesn't allow. Then even if you allow a policy, if you create a policy saying, say an L7 policy saying that something can talk to your workload, that will still get denied because the traffic from through the waypoint isn't allowed. So you now have to open up all traffic from the waypoint, at which point you're overwriting your sort of denial policy.
I think Keith was it Keith? Were you also trying to say something there?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if the mesh level. So basically, what you said, I wasn't sure if the mesh level policy was going to apply because of the extra sort of off hop through the waypoints. Yeah.
Yeah.
Trouble there.
I guess it maybe so. I think, and someone correct me if I'm getting one of these things wrong. I can definitely. I know for like a policy enforced the Z tunnel, creating an allow nothing policy has an empty selector, so it applies to all pods. That's quite achievable. You can put that in the Istio system. I don't see any documentation, but I might just missed it for an equivalent that would apply to waypoint or something that would be enforced through a waypoint. Like if I'm trying to picture a target ref, I don't think there's a way to make, say, a target ref that applies to all waypoints or all gateways. I think it has to be a concrete instantiation of a gateway. Like you know, I'm picturing I can't leave the name field blank or like in a wild card.
Yeah, I think that's where the target ref gateway class proposal, which there's a doc somewhere that talks about it, but I don't think we implemented it yet.
Yeah, I think I saw that in like the ambient capture doc as like one of the things mentioned, but yeah. So if that was something that was kind of on the plans as that's how it would eventually be achieved, then that makes sense.
Ian, was that what you were trying to weigh into?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that like our general handling of this is that things that have no target ref are enforced by Z-tunnel, whether they have a workload selector or just nothing at all. So it is a little weird to say like, oh yeah, except we have this one side case where that doesn't apply and we still read it anyway for you. And in that, in light of that, it probably would make sense to allow some sort of more general binding, like a gateway class or just something that applies to all gateways in general.
Yeah.
I think one of the confusions we had, Andrew and I, is that it's a little bit unintuitive. It seems like once a gateway is in the middle, right? So if pod A talks to pod B, the traffic is going to go through the waypoint. It seems like, if I understand correctly, the Z-tunnel policies no longer see that traffic as going from pod A to pod B, right? They see its sort of true path through the waypoint.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And so, for example, if you create a denial like deny traffic from A to B, the traffic will still flow just fine. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So the waypoint generally exists in the like destination namespace, and it does not spoof the client's identity as a result of that, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
Right.
I think that lines up with how we were interpreting it. So it feels very consistent, but it has definitely at least made things confusing for us when trying to use it. Like it felt surprising at first that I could have a deny A to B and it was being enforced at the Z tunnel, but if you put a waypoint in the middle, all of a sudden you've let that traffic through without realizing it.
Right. And this is essentially the property of the fact that this is a strictly layered system.
Yeah.
Intentionally, right? Like we had a lot of debate about this.
Yeah.
If we try to do inference, right, because we're using the same API, right, we have to hard partition which things are for waypoints and which things are for workloads. Seeing as waypoints were the somewhat additive part of the system, right, we require them to be explicitly referenced. And we also don't allow impersonation, right, just because we allow for waypoint composition. For instance, we can have waypoints that exist in other namespaces than the destinations themselves, and there are real use cases for that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, these are genuine artifacts of those design decisions, and the question is, do we have all the right compensations so people can get the behavior that they want? All right.
Yeah.
Like we did talk about having two APIs, right, to see if that will actually improve people's ability to understand this particular problem. And we just didn't implement the binding to gateway class to essentially give a kind of global, right, which is, I guess, you want a global deny by default. So that is probably our best tool for doing that.
Yeah, I think certainly for our immediate goals, that's definitely binding to gateway class would be great.
So we do have default by default. I'm sorry, default deny pattern at layer 4, right? So that's global and enforced by the zero trust tunnel. You, unfortunately, as a user, there's an extra step you have to do when the waypoint is in the middle. You have to explicitly allow the traffic from the waypoint to the destination, right? When you have this default denying policy globally for Z tunnel for layer 4, yeah. So that's one thing, and then the second thing is Louis and Ian and Keith just touched on. We don't unfortunately have global denying by default for layer 7, right? Because we don't support it at the moment. It was in design. I assume the default layer 4 denying by default is not sufficient for your case, because you could potentially have that along with a layer 7 specific policy to explicitly allow how traffic shapes from your client to your server.
Yeah, I think like we can get around it to some extent, where every time we build a waypoint, we need to also make sure that we give a allow nothing policy that's bound to that waypoint, and that achieves the same goal. It's just it means that we have to not make the mistake. You know, as an administrator, I would feel awkward having that system because people who didn't realize they had to do that extra step could accidentally allow more traffic than they need.
Right, exactly. And we can make it usable, but we can't enforce that people have this.
Yeah, that they use it correctly.
That they use it correctly, exactly.
But I think,
by the way,
I think the point's understood. Like, you know, happy to keep discussing, but I think, you know, I think we're all on the same page.
Yeah. By the way, are you guys a sidecar user before you try Ambient? Just curious.
So we're both with Canonical, and we are currently making a product that uses entirely Ambient. Me personally, I was coming from a previous job a while ago that was a sidecar user.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, because we do think this is quite confusing for people familiar with sidecar. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just saying, and I am new to Istio as we're developing this project, and yeah, it's took me a bit to get the kind of 2-layer system, and but it does make sense now that I understand it.
Ian, you seem like you had some reservations with the gateway class stuff.
No, actually, my question was going to be: is this something that we want to get on the 125 roadmap? Actually, because it does seem like the best option we have at the moment. And this really does feel like a pretty significant gap.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in theory it would be valid even backported, right?
Yep, yeah, that would be the next question. Is this going to be good for a dot release?
Yeah, I guess this is an interesting question. So, how do folks regardless of whether we actually do it for this feature or not? This is clearly strictly additive. It's clearly strictly backward compatible, and it doesn't require any new API surface. So, is this a reasonable candidate for a backport or a patch release? It would be the first of its kind, given that we just had GA. So I don't know.
It may require a new CRD. Do we cell validate the things that we're allowed to bind to? We might. I'd have to check on that.
Yeah, I think we do.
Yes, new CRD definitions, I think, cross the line for me when it comes to makes sense for patch release. It's also I would feel a little bit better if it were the first patch release as well, because most people don't consume the .0, at least not in prod. But we do have a 124.1 coming really soon. So it feels awkward to think about it being like a 124.3, for example, release, having that sprinkled in.
Yeah, I think the CRD update is probably the biggest knock against it. But
one other thing we could consider is bandage this with Istio Cuddle and add a -- default deny flag that just throws that policy out when you create a waypoint for you. It's also kind of kludgy, but maybe that's less scary to backport, and it has a benefit.
But how do you know if user wants it though? Only if they want.
Right? It's just ETO X or it's just ETO waypoint generator or whatever dash default deny.
So user basically specify that when they want it, right? But on the other side, it's the admin making the deny all policy. That's what I'm just thinking. And then it's the user or the owner of the namespace running this Istio Cuddle waypoint commands.
Yeah. At this point, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, this does not fully solve the problem by a mile, but is it helpful at all for folks to be able to say, well, I know I'm in this. I don't want stuff to just automatically bypass because I created a waypoint, so I'm going to add this flag on? Maybe. That's hard to say.
Keith?
I also I'm thinking about the practical concerns of this. We are currently going into the holiday season where even if you're not in the retail industry, work tends to slow down. The first 125 is on track. I think the release date's February. That's fairly early.
True.
And I think that I feel better about that timing as opposed to this were in June or something like that. And there's a lot of people might be doing a lot of serious dev work. I expect most organizations, at least in the US, are going to slow down considerably between now and January. And then waiting a month for 125 to come out with this target gateway class support with a clean UX tests, that probably feels like a fairly reasonable end state to me.
That seems very reasonable from our point of view.
I agree.
Better than I think we thought we would get. So.
Okay, I feel like that we're in a pretty good spot then. Andrew, Dylan, thanks so much for coming and bringing us this use case. We're excited to try to get this in for 125, and we'll link the when we create an issue for it, we'll link the issue in the release in the what's the word, agenda doc, so you can follow it and give us feedback on the UX that we create. But again, really appreciate you reaching out. This is fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks.
+1. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks.
Okay, Lynn, anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, sorry, I was talking on mute. Let's end this call on time, 2:00. Thanks, everybody. Apologies. Bye.
Bye, everyone.